So I wanted us to think a little bit about the whole contrast within our world, within our biblical tradition of tribalism versus diversity and inclusivity, all right? I think our tradition is constantly struggling with that. We had that huge conversation, earlier when we were considering how our community felt we were called to be inclusive of the LGBT community, for example. So the reason I'm bringing it just on the table again this morning is I think as we prepare to put a piece of Indigenous art on our north outside wall, and in keeping with the piece of art that will go on the north outside wall, we will welcome an art exhibit from probably 4 Mohawk artisans that will go up here in October. And 2 or 3 of those artisans have agreed to come and share their vision, their art, their spirituality within the service. So I was listening to ideas. I tried to go, that's why I was late. I was trying to find, you better be able to quote what you're talking about here. I went looking for this ideas and I couldn't find it. Where Paul Kennedy was interviewing a man who'd written a book who was talking about how Canada was settled and the principles by which those who are making decisions about who got into this country, the basis on which they made those principles. Very, very interesting. So their vision for Canada was we want all of the white Eastern Europeans who are farmers to come and settle our prairies. They accomplished that, didn't they? You German Mennonite people? Yeah. And they would only give temporary visas or welcomes to those who were not white. That was right, like in the principles that they were following. As a result, and this is kind of interesting, that so those people who came to us from the Caribbean, they could come up and work for a while, but we didn't want them here. We sent them back home, all right? Whereas if you were Mennonite or Polish or Russian, you're all out west. And this is just an aside, but it's quite interesting, I thought. As a result, none of our cities ever grew really, really huge. I mean, I look at Toronto as not a city girl and go, wow, it's just way too big. But in fact, the person who wrote the book is saying, the crazy thing is that actually it's not big enough to have a transit system that would not just only be economic, but it would also ensure that not everybody is on the road with their cars. So it would actually be better for the planet if the city was larger, then they could afford the public transportation system that would be kinder to the earth. It's an interesting way of thinking, isn't it? And I would say as a Canadian, I never think like that. Let's just keep it small, all right? Anyway, that's just an aside. The aside isn't, though, that in populating this country, those people who were making the decisions wanted it to be white. That was that. And we also know that in populating this country, initially, we wanted to oversee, control, and annihilate as best we could the population who was already living here who wasn't white. That's part of our history. And I would even go so far as to say, and this is just from my point of view, I know that as a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, there is something in my DNA that is just mildly racist. I know it. Something that is a little bit, entitled. And I can wrestle with that all I want. I know that when push comes to shove, what I might say around, yes, but theologically I believe this, but that doesn't reflect my core values. I know. It's just sitting there. And every once in a while when push comes to shove, wow, there it is. So as we welcome members from the Mohawk community into our church and into our service, I know that it is going to challenge some of us sometimes in October when we do that. There will be times when we're going, And so I just think it's important that we lay the groundwork for saying, people, this was our history. We don't need to take blame for it. We don't need to go, oh, we don't need to. I just think it's important that more than anything else, we stay on top of our own. We recognize what it's triggering in us. And then we wrestle with it's triggering in us. Yeah. So I've chosen 2 pieces of scripture, I think, that really highlight this tension within our tradition. The first is from the book of Ezra. So the Israelites have been, 6th century BC. Babylonians have come in, razed the city to the ground, taken the cream of the crop off to live into exile in Babylon. A few years later, a number of them come back, some of them with Babylonian wives. And the theologians, or the people thinking about Israelite identity, are going, things haven't been so good for a while, and we're wondering if it's because God is angry at us because we've ceased being a pure race. Seriously. So let's just take it to prayer, and let's see what God is informing us to do regarding all of these foreign wives. They may be problems. While Ezra prayed and made confession, weeping and throwing himself down before the house of God, a very great assembly of men, women, and children gathered to him out of Israel. The people also wept bitterly. Shechaniah, son of Jehiel, of the descendants of Elam, addressed Ezra, saying, "We have broken faith with our God and have married foreign women from the peoples of the land, but even now there is hope for Israel in spite of this. So now, let us make a covenant with our God to send away all these wives and their children, according to the counsel of my Lord and those who tremble at the commandment of our God, and let it be done according to the law. Take action, for it is your duty, and we are with you. Be strong and do it." Then Ezra stood up and made the leading priests, the Levites, and all Israel swear that they would do as had been said. So they swore. Then all the people of Judah and Benjamin assembled at Jerusalem within 3 days. It was the 9th month on the 20th day of the month. All the people sat in the open square before the house of God, trembling because of this matter. Then Ezra the priest stood up and said to them, "You have trespassed and married foreign women, and so increased the guilt of Israel. Now make confession to the Lord, the God of your ancestors, and do his will. Separate yourselves from the peoples of the land and from the foreign wives." Then all the assembly answered with a loud voice, "It is so. We must do as you have said." So you can see that within the Judaic Christian tradition, this is an older version of the story. We could go back 100 years, 200, 3 years and find the same version of this story, couldn't we? Right? The church has practiced this, right? All right. So then I think we always then need to find, all right, what is the voice within our sacred text that has not been heard or that we have not always wanted to hear? So this is from Matthew's account, the account of the man known as Matthew. So while Jesus was still speaking to the crowds, his mother and his brothers were standing outside wanting to speak to him. Someone told him, "Look, your mother and your brothers are standing outside wanting to speak to you." But to the one who had told him this, Jesus replied, "Who is my mother and who are my brothers?" And pointing to his disciples, he said, "Here are my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and my sister and my mother." I remember when I first thought about that passage years and years ago, I thought, oh, it's so harsh. But you hear what he's saying, don't you? Jesus was living in a culture where tribalism was rampant, and lines were drawn as a result of that understanding of tribalism. And he is trying to speak to those within his own tribe, saying, we have taken, as heirs of this tradition, we have made it about rules, and we have not listened to the invitation at the heart of this tradition, which is to live out of a much deeper ethic of inclusivity and welcome and love. And so his way of turning that understanding of tribalism on its ear was to say, you know what, all of this blood relation, or just because we go to synagogue together, or just because your grandfather and my grandfather, no. Because we know where that gets us, right? That gets us to an us and a them. And I don't need to tell you where the history of tribalism has taken the human community on this planet. So he says, the people who are in my tribe are those who live out of these core values. All right, so what would it look like if we tried to look differently at how we understand how we're related to one another in the human community? So I'd like to read an email that I received this week from an acquaintance because it really plays into this conversation. Hi, Lynn. Just wondering, what is the status of St. Andrew's Church? Is it still a fully accredited church? Is it still consecrated? Is it still associated with a specific denomination? These questions sort of came up recently, and I was hoping you might be able to answer them when you get a chance. So I think that the inquiry, it came from a conversation around the table last week. And I think it came as a result of all kinds of things. I think one of the people who made those inquiries was at the celebration of life last Saturday. It was a celebration of life where there was no reference to Jesus or God, because the person whose life we were celebrating didn't have a belief like that. Although it's the same person who made an incredibly generous gift to those of us who do live out of that tradition, right? It might have been a comment made because we rent our space, this space, to a group of women and some men who practice a more earth-based spirituality. Some of them would identify themselves as pagans. And honestly, if you've grown up as a Christian, that word pagan, come on, it's right up there with sex, right? It's right? Might be because we don't have any pews. Add it all up, right? Or the fact that we can actually take all of that music that doesn't refer to God and use it on Sunday morning and still understand it as a window to sacred practice. So ultimately what the person is asking about in that email, and it's not her, it wasn't, she was asking on behalf of the conversation that took place around a dinner table. And the conversation ultimately went like this: they aren't acting like the tribe. Either the tribe that is called the church, that comes with pews, a particular kind of language that reinforces the identity of the tribe, and music that sounds like church music, like Tom ought to be playing more Bach, I think, right? No jazz, Tom. And maybe we'd be reinstated if we had a bake sale or two. Because that's what the tribe did. Had bake sale. And so I think it's interesting that these conversations are taking place in the community, because Jesus was the center of conversations like that as well. People would look at him and go, yeah, but he's breaking the commandments. But he's not doing what he's supposed to be doing on the Sabbath. Because he challenged his tribe to rethink the way they understood themselves. Were they to be a light to the nation, providing warmth and hospitality for the world around them, or were they to be set apart, which ultimately means separate? And how you understand the role of the tribe will ultimately determine how you understand sacred space. So, for example, a few weeks ago when another event was held here, I think it was called Killer Women. It's not quite right, but it was a weekend acknowledging women crime writers. It was held here in the afternoon, and Janet Kella, who was among the organizers, asked if, she goes, Lynn, is it okay? I moved the lectern to the center, and she kind of sat there waiting to be reprimanded. And I just said, it's all movable. We want it that way. And her husband, Rob, who's done sound throughout the county, overheard the comment, and he said, you know, Lynn, I won't name names, but he said, I've done sound in a lot of different churches in this county. And I remember moving a lectern once, and the word that was used when I was told to put it back was abomination. So why is it important that we think about these things again? Well, there will be people, and there are people who think that, oh my goodness, they've gone and thrown the baby out with the bathwater. Who think that without Pews, without Bach, without a traditional understanding of God out there, that we are no longer living as heirs of this spiritual tradition. And like I said earlier, there were those who made the same accusations of Jesus. It didn't end well for him. Who was looking at the finest ethics within his tradition and suggested that the invitation to love, to be hospitable, and to practice justice were to be the watermarks of the tribe. Not the creeds, not the temple, not the purity of race, not the sacrifice. And here we are 2,000 years again later, and we need to wrestle again with what it means to live deeply out of this tradition. A tradition that we know upheld racism. Scottish Presbyterians really founded this country. They were among the power brokers. And racism was built into the very nature of the country when it was created, and racism was perpetuated as it continued to grow. So I just think at this time, as we're about to develop further partnerships, I mean, you know, we've done the Reaching for Rainbows, we've done 10,000 Villagers, there's the now we're going to cross the bridge, partnering with people with whom our country has a history. Partnering with people whose spiritual traditions may not always align with ours, but may have something to teach us. And I think that as we create further partnerships and learn to listen and respect one another, and maybe even be transformed by one another, it is important that we continue to be vigilant in our use of language, in the use of our building and our symbols, so that these things actually support our core values. Because all of these things send a message. And we need to ask ourselves this: with every symbol, with all the language we use about God, with the way we understand our building and our property, do these things speak to a core value of separation, which means these things are for the tribe? Or do they send a message that speaks to that larger vision of hospitality and inclusion and partnership and healing and restoration? And I know that there will be some of you, or a part of some of you, that asks, but then when do we stop being Christian? And it's an interesting question, isn't it? Because it comes from identifying ourselves with a tribe as opposed to identifying ourselves with the mystery that enfolds us all. So the truth is that at this stage of the game in 2018, it is clear that we have more in common with some Muslims and Buddhists and Jews and Hindus who live justice and practice kindness than we do with Southern Baptists. So you understand that conversation about the tribe, maybe won't get us where we need to go. So it is true that there are those in the county who are asking us to identify ourselves. Are you in the tribe or not? Is the heart of their question. And I'm the one who gets the emails. I'm the one who has the conversations on the street. But I think we all need to be able to wrestle and respond and find language to have the conversation, because it's the conversations that are going to make us all healthier. So if we were going to look again at that passage where Jesus says, it is the ones who do the will of my Father who are in my family. It is those who look out for the vulnerable, those who challenge unjust economic practice, those who make a place at the table for the lonely and abandoned. You finish off the list. Those who look out for the health of the creation, those who advocate on behalf of our relatives who have no voice. I'm going to play for you a song video right now that I think well speaks to this conversation, and I invite you following the service today to pick up this conversation over coffee about what does it mean to live out of the deepest values of this tradition. And how do we continue to work against that grain, because it's in all of us as Canadians, at some level, and as Presbyterians, to set ourselves apart in ways that may not get us to where we really need to go, which is the peaceable kingdom.